This is my floor, Lieutenant, not the field. These are my men, and they don't wait for paperwork. They do in my hospital.
The hallway of the Naval Hospital went silent the moment the fabric ripped. Every boot stopped moving. Every conversation died mid-sentence. All that remained was the sound of thread tearing loose from cloth, and the sharp gasp that followed it, because Dr. Grace Whitfield had just watched a piece of her past torn off her jacket in front of 40 Marines, a room full of strangers, and a man in a white officer's cap who had not yet said a single word. If you believe in second chances, in the quiet strength of people who serve without asking for recognition, then stay with me until the end of this story. And if it moves you even a little, I want you to like this video, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and subscribe to this channel because stories like this one deserve to be heard by more than just us. Grace Whitfield had spent the last 11 months in places most people only saw on the news. She was 34 years old, raised in a small town outside Lubbock, Texas, the daughter of a mechanic and a schoolteacher who never had much money but always had enough love to fill a house twice its size. She became a physician not for prestige, but because she remembered watching her younger brother, Caleb, struggle through asthma attacks as a child with no insurance and a mother crying in a waiting room. She swore she would never let another family feel that helpless. That promise carried her through medical school, through brutal residency nights, and eventually into a decision that shocked everyone who knew her gentle, soft-spoken nature. She volunteered to deploy as a combat medical officer. She did not go for glory. She went because when the Navy called for physicians willing to serve forward with Marine units in hostile territory, almost no one raised their hand. Grace did. She spent nearly a year patching gunshot wounds by flashlight, performing field amputations in the back of armored vehicles, and holding the hands of 18-year-old boys who called for their mothers as she worked to keep them alive. She lost patience. She saved more than she lost. And through it all, she wore a small patch on her jacket, a white cross stitched onto olive fabric, frayed at the edges from months of dust, sweat, and gunfire. It was not for decoration. Combat medics who served forward with infantry units earned that patch through blood, exhaustion, and unimaginable pressure. It was recognition among those who understood what it meant to run toward danger instead of away from it. When Grace finally returned stateside, she was reassigned to Balboa Naval Medical Center in San Diego, a massive hospital serving thousands of service members and their families. She expected paperwork, orientation, and a quiet transition back into a world with real beds and real coffee. What she did not expect was Margaret Doyle. Margaret, known to everyone as Nurse Doyle, had worked at Balboa for 19 years. She had never deployed. She had built her entire identity around discipline, hospital protocol, and an unshakable belief that rank and credentials should be earned through the proper channels she herself had followed. She was not a cruel woman by nature, but grief and bitterness had hardened something in her years earlier, after her own husband, a Navy corpsman, died overseas under circumstances the military never fully explained to her. Since then, she had grown suspicious of anyone who wore field patches or combat insignia without what she considered verifiable proof. She had seen imposters before, people who exaggerated their service for sympathy or advantage, and she had made it her personal mission to expose them. On Grace's very first morning walking the hallway toward her new assignment, carrying her old orange trauma bag out of habit rather than necessity, Margaret spotted the combat medic patch on her jacket. Something in her snapped. She did not ask questions. She did not check records. She marched directly up to Grace in front of an entire hallway of Marines waiting for sick call, grabbed the patch, and tore it clean off the fabric, declaring loudly that she was tired of people playing dress-up with symbols they had not earned, that real medics did not need a torn old field jacket to prove themselves, and that whoever Grace thought she was fooling, it would not work at her hospital. The hallway froze. Marines who had been laughing moments earlier stood in stunned silence. Grace did not shout back. She did not defend herself. She simply stood there, her fist clenched at her side, her eyes locked on the woman in front of her, saying nothing. Because 11 months in a war zone teaches you that some battles are not worth fighting with words, and because the ache in her chest was not anger. It was grief. That patch had been sewn back on twice by a field medic named Ortiz who did not survive the deployment. Carried more than fabric. It carried a promise she had made to herself never to forget the people she lost. And that is exactly the moment the red exit sign at the end of the hallway lit up as double doors swung open, and Rear Admiral Walter Hendricks stepped through, flanked by 2 aides, his white officer's cap catching the fluorescent light. Admiral Hendricks was not visiting Balboa for a routine inspection. He had specifically requested to walk through this wing because he wanted to personally welcome home a medical officer whose actions 6 months earlier had already become legend within certain classified briefings. Actions that had not yet been made public to the hospital staff, because paperwork for commendations moves slower than the truth of what actually happened on the ground. He saw the torn patch still clutched in Margaret's hand. He saw Grace standing motionless, her jaw tight, refusing to let a single tear fall in front of Marines who respected composure above almost everything else. And he understood immediately what had happened, because he had read the after-action report himself, more than once, late at night, unable to shake the details from his mind. 6 months earlier, during a nighttime ambush that pinned down 11 Marines in a collapsed structure after an explosion, Grace Whitfield had crawled through burning debris under active gunfire to reach 3 critically wounded men trapped beneath concrete. She refused evacuation twice. She performed emergency procedures using nothing but a headlamp and instinct while rounds struck the wall inches from her position. She kept all 3 men alive until support arrived, and when medevac finally lifted them out, she stayed behind with the remaining unit rather than leave before every wounded Marine was accounted for. The official report noted that her actions likely prevented at least 2 additional deaths. It also noted, in careful military language, that she had done all of this while suffering a fractured wrist she never once reported, because reporting it would have meant being pulled from the field. Admiral Hendricks walked slowly down the center of the hallway, his footsteps the only sound echoing off the tile. He stopped directly between Grace and Margaret. He looked at the torn patch still hanging from Margaret's fingers, and his expression did not carry anger, only a quiet, heavy disappointment that somehow felt heavier than shouting ever could. He asked Margaret, calmly, if she understood what that patch represented. Margaret, visibly shaken now, admitted she did not know the woman's history. She had simply assumed, based on appearances, that something did not add up. The Admiral turned to face the hallway full of Marines, corpsmen, and hospital staff who had gathered, drawn by the commotion. He told them, in a voice that did not need to be raised to command absolute silence, that the woman standing in front of them had crawled through fire to save 3 of their brothers 6 months ago in a night none of them would ever forget, because 2 of the men she saved were standing in that very hallway, having just been discharged from recovery that same week. He told them her wrist had been broken the entire time she worked to save those lives, and that she never once complained about the pain, because she was too focused on theirs. Then Admiral Hendricks did something that no one in that hallway ever forgot. He called the room to attention and he ordered every single service member present, officers, enlisted, doctors, nurses, everyone, to stand and salute Dr. Grace Whitfield not as a formality but as a debt owed. Chairs scraped back. Boots snapped together. 40 Marines rose as one, their hands lifted in salute toward the woman who, moments earlier, had been humiliated in front of them, her torn patch still lying on the floor. Grace stood in the center of that hallway, surrounded by silence and respect so thick it felt physical, and for the first time since coming home, she allowed herself to cry. Not from embarrassment, but from the release of 11 months of carrying grief she had never had space to put down. Margaret Doyle did not run from the moment. She walked forward, picked up the torn patch from the floor with trembling hands, and asked Grace, quietly, if she could help sew it back on. Grace looked at her for a long moment, then nodded because she understood grief when she saw it, and she recognized that Margaret's cruelty had never really been about her at all. It had been about a husband who never came home, and a woman who had spent years protecting herself from ever being fooled again. Word of what happened that day spread through the hospital and eventually through the wider Navy medical community. Not because Grace ever told the story herself, but because the Marines who stood and saluted her that afternoon made certain it was never forgotten. Margaret Doyle requested a transfer to the trauma intake unit shortly afterward, choosing to work directly alongside returning combat medics instead of avoiding them, determined to understand rather than judge. She and Grace, against every expectation, became close friends over the following year, bonded by a shared understanding of loss that few people outside military medicine could ever fully grasp. If this story touched something in you, if it reminded you that the people who serve quietly, who carry wounds you cannot see, deserve to be seen and honored, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment below sharing what moved you most. Your comments truly mean the world to this channel and to stories like Grace's finding the audience they deserve. And before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something simple. Comment the word respect below if you believe people like Grace deserve to be honored, not doubted. Grace Whitfield still wears that patch today, stitched back together with slightly uneven thread by hands that once tore it away in anger and later mended it in apology. She says it fits better now than it ever did before, not because the tear was fixed, but because of who fixed it and why. In a hallway full of strangers, in a moment of humiliation, she learned that sometimes the deepest respect comes not from those who never doubted you, but from those who once did and found the courage to stand corrected.